I found your Colin video from I think it was last Saturday where he had the Colin show and it was like 2 hours long.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So I so you made an interesting argument on how you cannot initiate force onto new victims or to new innocent victims, correct?
What I said was it's not self-defense if you're creating new victims.
It's not self-defense if you're creating new victims. Got it. So this is kind of interesting because um, when the topic extends to the problem of borders, and I would say that the whole concept of borders is really an anti-concept because, uh, first of all, it is you can't compare it as to my house because my house would be a form of private property or just property versus the border, which is an extension of public property, right?
Right, which is invalid as a concept.
It's a you're bundling two concepts together. So if I would say I would enact a policy, right? I'm gonna play pretend statist here, so get ready. So I have a policy in which I want to reduce the influx of immigrants and limit it up to the point where the immigration within a country it is merit based, right? So immigrants only come within a country if they're willing to contribute, and obviously this would have to go through a background check, right? Like looking at the immigrant's occupation. They're an engineer, a doctor, a lawyer in a prestigious field, and they come here to produce. Uh, First of all, I wanted to ask you how do you view merit-based immigration, and is merit-based immigration just another form of statist migratory policy?
Any kind of violent control over land that is improperly or invalidly owned is immoral. So if it's merit based, race based, like country of
Right.
origin based, like it doesn't matter what the criteria is, it's all going to initiate force on peaceful people. Yeah.
How would, and you probably don't have all the answers to this because I don't either. Um, how would, I'm trying to see how in an anarcho capitalist country.
That's a contradiction. What you just said is a contradiction.
Well, I know. First of all, in the video I remember it saying anarcho-capitalist society. What do you want me to uh, end the sentence with? It has to be a geographical area. I mean,
Well, a country is generally a thing now known as, something, a monopoly on force by a government. So if you're using country in a different way, that's fine. Then it's not a
I'm
contradiction.
using country is as a geographical area,
Okay, well, if that's all, okay.
not as
How do I
a
see
panoply of the use of force.
how do I see borders in an anarcho-capitalist region of the world? Let's say. Um, I,
Right.
I, it would depend on a myriad of factors. If it's surrounded by enemies that want to kill people, it will probably have mutual agreements among the property owners to secure its borders, and those agreements and that force used to secure the borders will not be immoral because it will be protecting private property instead of invalidly owned communal property. Uh, and all the people living there would consent to it. Um, by definition because you called it an anarcho-capitalist country. So if it wasn't consensual, then you couldn't call it anarcho-capitalist. So that would be axiomatic for your example. Um, if it were a series of circumstances that would leave it vulnerable to various problems, then they could agree to have restrictions on who could enter and leave because it's private property. Like, you can do that.
But what is the standard on which one defines who stays and who leaves? Or should that just be left to private hands or private arbitration?
I mean, what are the standards for who gets to come in your house?
Well, I would say it has to be someone I know, a relative of mine, someone who does not give the impression that they are either trespassing on my property without my consent or initiating force onto my property.
That sounds good. And the only thing that would probably change is if you had a business that you wanted to sell things to, or you wanted to be open to the public, then
Right.
you would probably have a different policy that would allow people that you didn't know or that you weren't friends with to enter the property, right?
Right, I agree with that. But let's say I'm immigrant X is now part of this anarcho-capitalist country, right? And let's say that immigrant comes from a family of a disenfranchised family economically. And obviously, you and I will know that in an anarcho-capitalist system or country, right? You would there are protection agencies, and you would have to pay a fee for that service, which is levying you that protection. So if I cannot afford, to be protected by, let's say, protection agency A, should I lose my rights in that situation?
What right would you lose?
Well, let's say I'm subscribed to my local protection agency,
I'm sorry. I'm
and
sorry. This happened in our last conversation, and so I don't want to even let it begin in this conversation. I asked you a direct question. Can you begin your response with an answer to that question? What right would you lose if you couldn't afford it?
uh, how about the right to the right to free speech, or the right of life, or the right to life?
So you'd have to break those rights down to what they actually, like, their fundamental thing. Like,
So
you never
the
had a free speech. You never had a right to free speech on property you don't own. So
right,
are you
because
saying that
it's
you
not
would?
absolute.
So you're saying that you would lose the ability to say what you wanted on your own property?
Well, no, you asked me for a general example or an example of a right, and I used several there.
I,
So,
I asked you what right you would lose if you weren't able to pay for whatever defense company you were looking to pay for.
well, in that case, I would say the right to life, because if I lose my protection that this protection agency is supplying me, then who am I going to protect myself? That's
Does somebody else have an obligation to protect you for you?
I never said that someone else has an obligation to protect me.
So it
It's
was
just,
never anyone else's responsibility but yours to protect you. And somebody else not protecting you is not you losing the right to life. You still have, the right to protect your own life.
well, I have the right to protect myself, of course, but
So you haven't lost any rights.
well, let's be clear here because rights obviously exist in a social context, and I have the right to defend myself, independently, and I could do so without a protection agency, right? But there are so many variables that kind of get unfeasible there when you start to think, well, what if this person is not physically fit in order to protect themselves? And they've already lost any, security and protection that could be offered by a corporation to protect that individual.
So what you
Uh,
probably meant to say then is, what about your capacity to defend your life? Because you
right.
still have a right to defend your life. You haven't lost that. So you're worried about your capacity to defend your own life.
Capacity or the ability, I would use those words, or the potential to sustain my own life.
Well, that is all of our own responsibilities, right?
I'm not denying that. I'm just,
So what's the problem?
well, the, what I see what the problem is just how. Let's just let's just assume that, and this happens independently of what system people live under. There are going to be people that are going to uh, try to either manipulate the system, right? So, and that'll be another point that I'll address. And there's going to be people that are going to, free ride, probably, uh, if they withdraw protection from a certain company because, let's say, that company uh, jacks up their prices. That's a possibility. Uh, how would a person in which has no desire to or not to use desire, does not could have the physical capacity to protect his or her own self from external force that could be initiated by others? How would that be feasible if, you know, let's say I'm disabled, right? And that comes with some physical and mental restraints that comes with impediments, of course. And so I'm obviously going to be reliant on other people, right? So once, let's say, for an example, the protection agency forfeits, uh, its security to uh, shield me against any threats that I might face by my neighbor, right? I am physically incapacitated, and now I have lost my ability to pay that protection agency. What would I do then? Is my question to you.
What do disabled people do now for food?
What do disabled people do now for food?
Mm-hmm.
Well, in the mixed economy that we have, they either depend on the welfare state or they depend on private charity
And
in
if a
order to
politician
access.
and if a politician attempted to pass a law to get rid of that welfare state that protected the poor and disabled people from their welfare, things like free or subsidized medical care, free or subsidized food and housing, there would be a massive outcry against that politician because there is a massive demand for services to help people that are genuinely in need. Because people
Right.
generally want to help each other. I would definitely
Okay.
want, I would definitely want in a free society there to be some sort of voluntary service that helps the people that actually need it. Now, in a free society, it would look absolutely nothing like the government welfare state that gives probably 80% of the resources it puts
Right.
towards those ends. Those resources probably end up in the hands of people that actually don't need them. Um,
Okay.
and you'll see private charities do a much more efficient job with directing the resources to those people. But there's a massive demand, as proven by the fact that the government welfare programs are massive, because people want them. I mean, hell, the entire left wing of the political spectrum outright demands that stuff. So you should expect half of the population of a
And the
free
right to.
society. It's very true. Except the right prefers more like church-based charity,
No, and for
community-based
corporations and
charity. And there is, and
right.
yeah, the yeah, you're right. The majority of corporate donations to charities come from right-leaning
Right.
CEOs and such. So anyway, the summary of what I was trying to say is that there's a big demand for services to help people in need. So I can't imagine that not existing in a free society. If you're asking me how I think it might be implemented, I would take, yeah, I can't predict how the cotton will get picked after we free the
Yeah, it's
slaves,
probabilistic.
but I mean, a couple ideas is that I have a feeling that the more reputable dispute resolution companies will offer services to people for free or for discounted rates if they can, show disability or lack of income, because it will be great PR for them. I might also suspect that DROs might allow people, a checkbox on their monthly bill to toss $5 into the 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 charity pot to provide services to disabled people. I would definitely check that box, as long as I had some kind of faith that the services were not being given to people that could afford them for themselves. I mean, I can think of 1,000 ways that that would be paid for. Like a DRO, like imagine the PR nightmare that a DRO would have if a YouTube video surfaced of one of its defense agents standing by while a poor person was attacked, and the agent, just basically looked at his tablet and said, "Sorry, you don't have a subscription. I'm just going to stand here and watch you get attacked." Imagine how quickly that defense agency would go out of business. Like, I don't even, out of all the things I'm worried about in a free society, like, this is not one.
Right. You can imagine too that it's interesting because before the institution of the welfare state in the United States, during the 19th century, there were mutual aid societies, right? And if, let's say, and this was a precursor to insurance, let's say a natural catastrophe happens, right? And the hurricane comes and it blows my roof off, right? I'm guaranteed some, repair work that is subsidized by my neighbors voluntarily. So maybe if we can apply the same concept of mutual aid societies that worked in the 19th century to 21st century or, uh, you know, Ancapistan, in which you, people voluntarily donate their finite resources in order to help the poor or the disabled to access aliments or even the protection of their rights, then yeah, I see that as feasible.
And the contemporary proof is that it exists now through government because of the level of demand for that kind of social welfare.